No, I was just starting to really get into making this diorama. I don't want to stop now.
You are me. Or you.
No!
Mandala.
Oof! Ow! Did you really need to do that hard? Ow! Seeing as we're here now, might as well show off the next part in our Triumvirate MEGAmiibo series. Whoops, wrong MEGAmiibo series. Here we have already finished Kozuna, so let's go down in chronological order, and so now it's the turn for Horrorboros. So, let's get started on the big snake. As with the other ones, we started with a crumpled up paper base, which was then covered with a layer of aluminium foil, and this was then covered with air drying clay. Then, for the next step, I covered this again with a layer of epoxy sculpt. This was to make it even sturdier and to make use of the ability of epoxy sculpt to cure up a lot smoother than other clays. And yes, I know that for our Idols MEGAmiibo series, we made Master Mega just from air drying clay, but he had a lot more open surfaces, which made sanding him a lot easier. But with Horrorboros he has a lot of internal curvature, so yeah, that's not gonna be as easy. So, epoxy sculpt it is. This was then first used to cover up the inside of Horrorboros' mouth, which was then extended to the outside of his head. Here I first made sure to get a smooth, consistent layer of clay on top of his head, after which I started to smooth out the layers and extend the lips of the king a little bit further. Then with my large silicone tools, I sculpted the overlap on his lips, and I also added his gills behind these. And lastly, I sculpted the double chin and smoothed this into the rest of the head. Then I used the last little bit of clay that I had left from this portion to extend the clay over his neck as far as it went. After which I used my bowl tools to make the ridges on the inside of his mouth, and cleaned up the rest of the edges on his mouth while I was there. Then, while the head was drying, I could work on the other two parts of the sculpture. Starting by adding a small thin layer of clay onto the parts of the tail where the scales were visible, and using this little custom stamp that I had made from a broken sculpting tool and some aluminium wire, I was able to add the scales on both the tail and later also on his back. With the head dry and even the scales on his back already cured, I had a chance to add both of his wings using some 5mm EVA foam, which I had also chamfered to match the sculpt. These were then used as a base to add a layer of epoxy sculpt on top of, first smoothing out the different sheets into one layer, after which I then add the pointy tip to the end of the wing, and I finish this off with some more clay on the back to add a very thin edge to the wings. And since I had a small amount of clay left over, I could use this to add some wrinkles around his eyes. This portion was then also used to make the bases of Horrorboros' alligator clamps that are going to be attached to both sides of his head. The only thing left to do to these were to add these 8x15mm pieces of 5mm EVA foam. This foam was then also used for his hair, with a little extra layer of foam on the end to bulk it out a little bit more, and then I used my heat gun to seal the foam and to curve the hair to make it face a little bit more outwards. Then some 2mm craft foam was used to make a 20mm wide circle, and on top of that I placed this 10mm wide circle with a 3mm piece sticking out. These are then finished with a little piece of aluminium wire that will then make the 3 pads on the sides of Horrorboros' head. With one without a wire, but you'll later see why. Because for now, we first have to superglue the pieces of hair to Horrorboros' head, taking really good care to make sure that we get the placement correctly. Afterwards, I use a little bit of accelerator to activate the glue instantly. Now we get to add the 3 pads to the side of his head. And lastly, I only need to move the wires to their final position and cut them to size with my side cutters. And then using some more of that aluminium wire, I made these belt buckles with a piece of wire and a 5x10mm block of 2mm EVA foam. Then to finish these off, I used this textured plastic packaging belt to make the belt that holds up his pants, with one strip that is connected to the buckles, by heating up the plastic and forming a little bit of a hook to go through the aluminium loop. I then glue the other side to his scales, and finally I use another one that wraps around the tail to cover up both of the loose ends of the plastic belts. With these added, next up is the tube that comes out of the back of his mouth. I use this piece of plastic gardening support for like plants and stuff. Any thick plastic tubes will work for this. Next up, we heat up the plastic to make these bends. Then I cut it to size and placed it into the hole that I'd already pre-drilled into the back of his mouth. Now I have it to where I can connect this to the plastic pen that I'd made off camera with some plastic art, using a 40mm wide circle and a little truncated cone pattern. This pen is then first glued to the tube, and after a little bit of trimming the size, I placed some more glue onto the lips of Horrorboros, and then I should have heated one of the bends to make the tube flexible again, and then perfectly placed the pen onto the glue to attach the hole to Horrorboros, but of course I had to be stubborn and try to force it. Yeah, do as I say, not as I do. But at least now we can finish up the pan, which only required us to add these small little handles to the sides using some more 2mm aluminium wire. Now all that was left for the accessories was to add Horrorboros' teeth. So with a lot of these 5x5 pieces of 5mm EVA foam, I could use a little puddle of super glue that I'd made on the side to dip the pieces of foam into before I pressed it to the lips of Horrorboros that I'd also already coated with a bit of accelerator for an instant glue up. And then we have this series' favorite, the balls of hot glue made with our silicone molds to use for the eyes. And so, with 2 of these made, we are ready for painting. Wait, Muna, you got something fun in mind? Okay then, let's then first get started with a layer of white primer through our airbrush. Starting with the tail, then the head, and lastly, off camera, I'd also painted the back. With the primer dry, I then filled the airbrush with a desert yellow from the army painters, used it for the belly of the snake throughout the whole figure. Once that was dry too, I mixed up an angel green with some stone grey to make the skin color to use for Horrorboros' skills. And by using the airbrush for these first few layers, I can combine both the desert yellow and the angel green mix for a very smooth transition between the two. The same technique is then also used for a small layer of pixie pink for a little bit of a pink accent on the ends of his wings. Then to the smaller details with the brushes, beginning with a layer of red on one of the alligator clips. And of course, we also need a black one for the other half. The same dragon's red is then also used for the inside of Horrorboros' mouth, all the while making sure to not touch the teeth that I just primed with white, same as the hair, and the wire that I just painted with black. Then the traditional army green for the pants of the salmonids. After which I started with the hair, with a layer of jungle green for the ends, which I then transitioned into a green skin for the middle, and then a mix of angel green and green skin for the final darkest layer. This darkest green was then also used for the middle of the pads on the sides of his head. But before all of that, I first needed to paint the edges with an ash grey. Then I painted the teeth with the white. Then we're almost back to the present, but we only have a layer of bright red and black on the wires left, and all the while I mixed up a blend of gunmetal and black for a nice dark coat on the pad itself. Now that we're back to the present, we actually first have to leave those colors to dry. So why not go to the tail and add a layer of mummy's ropes onto the belts. The same mummy's ropes was then also used for a layer of dry brushing on the highlights of the desert yellow belly. Then some tanned flesh is used for the transitional color between the desert yellow and the red inside of his mouth. And I also use this for the insides of the gills and to accentuate the other layers of gills underneath the pads. Then while that dries, I mixed a little bit more black into the armor green to make for a shadow highlight that I painted underneath all of the folds that I had sculpted into the pants. Oops, sorry. Then I just needed to do a bit more blending of the colors by adding a small amount of the normal army green onto my brush and then going over the edges of the stale wet mix to blend it into a smoother transition before I called it good. Because I had one more thing to make, the Booyah Bomb to place into the mouth of Horrorboros. Luckily for us, I ordered a massive amount of these 40mm wide plastic DIY Christmas ornaments from Amazon, so I just needed to scuff up both the outside and the inside with sanding sponge and remove the little loops. After which I can add some more of our good old Citadel contrast orc flesh through our airbrush to cover both sides with this transparent green paint. And where we're at it, why not also use this Citadel Contrast Imperial Fist for the eyes?
Sure.
That's such a good idea, Muna, good thinking! And we can then also use both ends of the wires to come out of the pan. So they go through the alligator clips and then connect to the final pads on each side. That sounds great. Wait, what? Numa, get back here! Oh well, I guess I have to. Not only for the eyes of the bomb, but to also use for these lanterns that Horrorboros has on the side. All made with more and more of these hot glue balls. Although for these we had to heat up the ends again, and then using a bit of parchment paper to roll them into a point to get a more bulb shape. When all 8 of these are then finally wired up together, I can add the foam board plate to the bottom of Horrorboros' head to still be able to connect it to the base, but leave the option open to be able to remove him to change out the battery. At least I was already able to use these platforms to connect the tail and the back together. And so we scratch up the paint a little bit to rough up the surface to add a drop of hot glue to attach each of the lanterns. Then each of the plugs for the foam board platform was already super glued to the base. And after marking out what areas were still left open, I then cover this with a thick layer of Mod Podge, and then I go to the airbrush and only blast air through it to create these miniature ripples for the water. All the while, I had already added a layer of hot glue to the bottoms of each of the pieces with the transparent hot glue to connect all 3 and to add the effect to make it seem like Horrorboros is jumping in and out of the water. So now all that was left to do is to add the layers of transparent green paint on top of that and the rest of the water effects. Then, while those dry, I can add the missing logo to the front of the Booyah Bomb. And with the water effects dry, I can add a thinned out white to all of the edges to make for some foam to go on top of these very wild waves that Horrorboros is creating. Then, for one of the final things, I made a very thinned out selection of Dragon's Red, Toxic Mist for Teal, Desert Yellow, and Jungle Green paints for the iridescent effect of the King Salmonid scales. Here I painted on a little C shape on the edges of a random set of scales, while still looking out for a consistent level between all of the different colors. Next, after I finished placing each of the colors, I go back to the center of each color with only water on my brush and paint this onto the middles. After which I go over these with a paper towel and dab away the wet parts to give a more subtle touch to the effect and to leave a little bit more pigment on the edges than the middle. Then, as the second to last thing, I quickly glued some 2mm EVA foam over some of the wires around the lanterns to clean these up a little bit. And now I'm covering these with some more gunmetal. And finally, I finish up Horrorboros with a layer of gloss varnish over everything except for the pants and the pads, which I'd already covered with some matte varnish. And of course also the lanterns and the wires and the pan, since those just need to be clean.
Hola! Hey!
But with that, we finished the second part of the Triumvirate, the Horrorboros MEGAmiibo. Hey Creagears, Robo here, and we hope you enjoyed a look at our Horrorboros MEGAmiibo. Now we only have the big guy, the Megalodon left. And with that we will not only have our full Triumvirate, but this will also complete our Sockeye Station diorama as the last of the missing Salmonid amiibos. But Joe will have to sadly wait until the next video. And also, something we want your opinion on, because sadly our Grisco helicopter that we had made when we first did the diorama fell recently. But unlike most times where we just had to reglue one of its propellers, probably about twice a month, it now has such significant damage that I'm starting to think it might just be best to remake it. Especially since when we did the diorama, you know, when Splatoon 3 wasn't even released yet, no one could get a model of it anywhere, so I was kind of forced to make one in our own 3D CAD software, which was quite a challenge. And of course, with my perfectionism, I never really thought of it as perfect enough. So how about we do one more MEGAmiibo? But this time it's just gonna be the helicopter on an acrylic rod flying over the water. It might not become a full video, maybe just a short, but this way we can remake him in a much better scale, add some more details, like maybe even the sliding doors and an actual interior. And with it being on a separate platform, we can finally move him out of the way to not bump into it all the time and break the propellers all the time. So, if you would actually like to see that, please leave a comment down below. Yes! But first, keep those creative gears turning, and we will see you guys in the next video.
Yippee!